she lost a lifestyle when her father died. And then she took up with Jeffrey Epstein. She tried to persuade him to marry her. He wouldn't marry her. And then she started procuring very young girls and women for him, and thereby regained the lifestyle. So if you were to look at this from the outside, you would say she was incredibly rich, lost nearly everything, and then through committing crimes with Jeffrey Epstein, became fabulously wealthy again.
But now, Dorothy Byrne has worked in journalism for many decades, beginning in her mid-20s at the Waltham Forest Guardian, having written a sharp letter to 50 local newspaper editors. She later moved into television and found huge success in what was predominantly a male-dominated world. She spent a large chunk of her career as head of news and current affairs at Channel 4, where her commissions included investigations into Cambridge Analytica, the Michael Jackson expose, Leaving Neverland, and the BAFTA-winning documentary For Sama, about one family's life under siege in Aleppo, which also won an Oscar nomination. And now she's back with a timely 3-part series on Ghislaine Maxwell, charting her journey from prime socialite to being at the centre of a sex trafficking ring with paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Ghislaine Maxwell, it's called The Making of a Monster, begins tonight on Channel 4 at 10 p.m. and Dorothy Byrne joins me now. Dorothy, you've said that, you know, if we believe in equality, we have to treat male and female sexual predators equally. So did you set out on this journey with an agenda in particular to do that?
I thought it was a fascinating story, but I didn't realise the extent of her crimes until we began the investigation. So I just had no idea quite how bad she was.
It's interesting you say that, because I have to do a disclaimer and say that I do appear in a part of it, having met her a few times in the 80s and 90s, which you and I discussed. And when we talked about it in the beginning, you were very much, you know, going on an investigative journey into who she was. I don't think you'd come up with the title The Making of a Monster at that point. So did your view of who she is change in the course of making the film?
Yes, it did change. And I have to say, Mariella, I admired you for agreeing to be in the film and for the fact that you said openly to me that you knew her and you liked her, because I approached quite a number of people who were rather good friends with her who didn't want to speak or denied that they knew her. But actually, 3 of my own friends knew her at Oxford and early on after she left Oxford. And they all said that she seemed to be a perfectly nice person, perhaps obsessed with her father, liked partying, liked to be the centre of attention, maybe not the deepest woman they'd ever met, but certainly not somebody where you could have predicted that they would be involved in the trafficking of hundreds of girls for sex. It's an extraordinary move from, you know, Oxford graduate and socialite to one of the worst sex offenders that I've ever come across.
Yeah. And I would have concurred with your friends. I mean, I only ever met her socially, as I said to you, and she seemed to be all of the things you just described. You don't go with the sort of Freudian analysis of it in terms of the fact that, as you said, a difficult relationship with her father. I think difficult would be an understatement, you know, if some of the stories about their relationship are to be believed. I mean, he was a, you know, famous bully, violent, you know, all of those things, and she was very much enthralled to him or in his control, wasn't she? But I suppose that you've had to make a decision about whether to look at that relationship and look at the psychology of her repeating it, which seems very much to be the case, you know, looking at your film with Jeffrey Epstein, to actually saying this is monstrous.
I think that you can look at Ghislaine Maxwell and see that she had a very strong relationship with her father, who was a crook, a tyrant, a bully, treated people as trash, and then had a relationship like that with, or had a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, who similarly treated people like trash. But that doesn't justify what she did. And I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know why she, I can't explain why she committed those terrible crimes. But what does stand out when you look at her life is that because of her father's crimes, she lived a life of great luxury. And as somebody who knew her when she was very rich because of her father said, she lost a lifestyle when her father died. And then she took up with Jeffrey Epstein. She tried to persuade him to marry her. He wouldn't marry her. And then she started procuring very young girls and women for him, and thereby regained the lifestyle. So if you were to look at this from the outside, you would say she was incredibly rich, lost nearly everything, and then through committing crimes with Jeffrey Epstein, became fabulously wealthy again. And we're talking about a life of fabulous wealth. They flew everywhere in private planes. He owned his own island. He owned the biggest house, individual's house in New York. He bought her a 17 million, or gave her money and she bought a $17 million house. So,
but none of those things are criminal, are they? I mean, in a way, you sort of think, well, Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell is in jail. Where are all the men, those men, the plane full of scientists who travelled down to the island, that was full of constantly of young teenagers who'd been procured by Ghislaine? Where are there's endless pictures in the documentary of Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein with incredibly powerful and famous people. Why has the entirety of Jeffrey Epstein's crimes and Ghislaine's, where she was involved in them, why have they fallen on just this one person who's locked up in jail, and none of those? We talked actually to one of the victims of the couple, Sarah Ransom, the other day, and whilst she was satisfied with the sentencing of Ghislaine Maxwell, she was really animated about the fact that all of these people, these perpetrators, had, as far as she was concerned, got away with it.
I completely agree with you. It's ludicrous and utterly wrong that the only person to have been jailed for sex offences carried out by men, but also Ghislaine Maxwell herself did assault some of these women, but the only person done for it is a woman. And the authorities in the United States should now be going out and seeking down the other male perpetrators. I should say, though, that not every man that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell was ever seen with was necessarily at all involved in their crimes. And just being seen with a criminal doesn't make you a criminal. But undoubtedly, other men came to the house and to the island to have sex with underage girls and very young women who had really been lured into this terrible sex trafficking pyramid, and none of them have been prosecuted, and that is utterly wrong.
You managed to get some rather fascinating exclusives. You mentioned the island there, and I think one of the most unsettling ones in a way was this very normal-seeming South African couple, Kathy and Miles, who managed the island and speak I think for the first time about life on Little St. James. They mention how they saw Prince Andrew on a visit and, how friendly he and Ghislaine were together. But they also do refer to the fact that there were all these young girls there. And it feels like they're in a very difficult situation. How did you, in terms of explaining what they saw and what they didn't see? I mean, it reminded me a bit of that book by Gita Sereni, Albert Speer's Battle with the Truth, that sense of how we, in some ways, can choose our own memories.
Well, they are a very interesting couple, aren't they? And yes, it is the first time that they've spoken. And, the wife says that Ghislaine Maxwell was always looking for massage therapists. And she says, the younger, the better. She says, Maxwell did everything to make sure that Epstein was happy. Girls were coming and going. And at one point, she says to us that some of these girls left the island very suddenly. And they say that even although there were semi-naked, very young girls there all the time, they had no idea that anything untoward was happening. Of course, what the prosecution said was that actually, in the words of one of the lawyers for the victims, it was in fact a sex trafficking camp, but this couple didn't notice that.
That's interesting, but on the other hand, you've got these people who 30 years before any of this Epstein situation began, when Ghislaine Maxwell was at university and everything, and when her father was still alive, are sort of remembering her as this macabre character who, you mentioned there were just a couple of bits where I just felt, I don't really feel that is that's a witness who has a clear uncomplicated relationship to the subject. You mentioned about how she lost a lifestyle, and that line I think came from Mike Maloney, who was the Maxwell family photographer, who seemed incredibly bitter and twisted about almost everything. And sort of you have this sobbing Ghislaine Maxwell on the day her father's died when she arrives, and he sort of says, yes, was she crying about her dead father or the loss of her lifestyle? That seemed a pretty great leap of supposition and slightly unfair, if I can say that, because, obviously at that time she wasn't a convicted sex offender.
No, not at all. And she was absolutely devastated by the death of her father. There's no doubt about that. But it is a fact that with his death, she also lost a lifestyle. And she'd been used to extraordinary wealth, and almost overnight it disappeared. And then she went to New York to start a new life and took up with Epstein, who was a very wealthy man. And lo and behold, she gets her lovely, rich lifestyle.
Indeed, but in a criminal case, Dorothy, in a criminal case, that would all be supposition, wouldn't it? And there's another bit just that, I mean, I have to just say it because I think we're both women and we know what the sort of things that get said about women. And there's this writer, Kornbluth, I think he was called, in the programme, and he says that she propositioned him at a party. I mean, not to be rude, but I find it slightly unlikely. And he says that what she actually said there was, if you lose 10 pounds, I'll have sex with you, which sounds like a kind of stupid joke at a party rather than a proposition, as he was hardly going to lose the 10 pounds.
Well, actually, I have to say that we interviewed two men, middle-aged men, neither of them, no offence meant to them, particularly attractive, who didn't know each other, and she propositioned them at parties in very similar ways. I just thought it was interesting that a woman would walk up to a man that she didn't know and say that she would have sex with him. And there's some other bits about her general behaviour that are unusual and different. propositioning a man at a party isn't a crime, of course.
Indeed. The series is also packed with, as I said, new revelations. I mean, I found that couple absolutely fascinating. But also there's people talking about some of the things that the younger Ghislaine got involved in. And you do have clinical psychiatrist Nicola Glucksmann, who attended one of Ms. Maxwell's famous parties in 1991, recalling a particular event. Should we have a listen to it?
I remember Ghislaine as very beautiful, charming, hugely entertaining, but slightly manic. I was invited as a +1 to a weekend party at Headington Hill Hall. Ghislaine was hosting herself. She was always scanning the room. At the end of the dinner, Ghislaine announced that it was time for some games, and she disappeared and came back with some scarves, but explained that she was going to give each of the men a blindfold, and they were to blindfold themselves, and then the women were to take off their tops and bras and present their breasts to the men, and then the men would feel the breasts and make an attempt to match the breast by weight and cup size to the woman who was attached to the breasts. It was all bundled up as fun. Ghislaine was very relaxed about it. This was a gift she was giving us. I absented myself. I excluded myself and said I was tired and left, as did my friend. But I was very struck by how awful that idea was.
And Dorothy, there are a couple of anecdotes like that from parties back in those days that really ring quite loud warning bells. Do you think we struggle to think of the possibility of a woman being a sexual predator?
Definitely, and a number of people, while we were making this film, said to me, oh, a woman can't be a predator, so, you know, she can be a procurer, but she cannot be a predator. And one of the things I think that has surprised people, and it surprised me at first, was that she took part in the sexual assaults of quite a number of the girls. She didn't just bring them to Jeffrey Epstein. They assaulted the girls together. And it's disturbing. And that story that we just heard there is a very disturbing story about women not being respected equally and just sleazy and disgusting.
Absolutely. You famously, or infamously perhaps, depending on your point of view, described Boris Johnson as a known liar, comparing his media strategy to Vladimir Putin in the prestigious McTaggart lecture that you delivered. How hard did you think about including that in your speech? And do you regret those comments now, or feel that you were pioneering?
I feel very strongly that I was right to say that Boris Johnson was a known liar. I listed quite a number of his lies up to that moment. There have been a number since. And I said, what do we do when the Prime Minister is a known liar? And I said, when a politician is a liar, we shouldn't pussyfoot about. We should say he's a liar. And to be honest, if a number of other journalists had also called out his lies earlier on, I don't think we would be in the position that we're in now. Even this morning on the radio, I was listening to a presenter and a reporter trying to use every way of describing the recent events with Pincher, so as not to actually use the word liar. But if journalists, when they have researched and investigated something properly about a politician, find that the politician has lied, they should say it. Because normal members of the public are going about their daily lives. They are not in a position to stop their work and investigate the truth or otherwise of what politicians say. And I really think that our politics has got itself in a mess because people have not been prepared to say the fact of what Boris Johnson is. He's a known liar.
It was suggested then that your comments in the lecture led to the cancellation of an interview with the Prime Minister. But do you think that they also began the sort of death knell for Channel 4? And do you feel any sense of I don't know, guilt about that?
No, I don't. I don't think it is at all the case. At that time, not just Boris Johnson, but a number of other British political figures had stopped appearing on Channel 4 on Newsnight to do major interviews on the Today programme, and were just putting themselves up for very quick news bites. So it wasn't because of me that politicians stopped appearing on television. They'd already stopped doing that, and actually only began again really because of the pandemic. And I don't think that Channel 4 is being privatised for any reason other than to throw a bit of red meat to Boris Johnson's supporters from the right, because he's on the ropes.
And why do you think Channel 4 represents red meat for those supporters? And what do you think the impact of that privatisation will be? We've talked at length with Alex Mahon just quite recently at the Founders Forum.
Well, I think it's part of the view of some right-wing conservatives that privatisation is always good. And so it's a tick there. Personally, like most people in this country, I think some privatisations are good, and other privatisations, like the privatisation of the probation service, turned out not to be good. I do worry about the effect on British broadcasting and news, because Channel 4, because it's owned by the people of Britain and it doesn't make a profit, it's not there to make a profit, produces an hour of in-depth news a night. It produces expensive documentaries and current affairs programmes. And I don't think that will remain the case after many years if it is privatised.
Do you think it's a concern for the BBC to be the only public sector broadcaster?
Yes, I do. I think that one of the reasons that our broadcasting is genuinely admired around the world by people is that we've got a range of views and a range of broadcasters. Channel 4 is different to the BBC. I know in the time that I was there, we often won more awards than the BBC won, even although we were much smaller. And that, I know for a fact, made people in the BBC up their game and improve some of their current affairs and documentaries, because the competition was there. Channel 4 is competition to the BBC. And I personally don't think it's good to have just one main public service voice. You know, when I was brought up, I'm 70 now, there was the BBC, ITV came along, it had lots of money, so it could do very good news and current affairs. And that was a really major improvement in our public democratic life. So the amount of money that you get by privatising Channel 4 is frankly piffling compared to the good it does society.
Just finally, you just said you were 70 there, and you've described yourself, in fact, I think it was during that McTaggart lecture, if I'm not mistaken, as just about the oldest female TV executive working for a broadcaster. Do you think that the shape of broadcasting has changed dramatically in your lifetime? You talked in the McTaggart about the difficulties of being a woman in the job that you've chosen. And I think there are still women today who might say that it remains challenging in places. What are your thoughts?
Oh, of course it remains challenging, but it's much, much better than it was. when I first worked on World in Action, at that point I was the only woman. Now, if you look at British Broadcasting, the head of news at Channel 4 is a woman, the head of ITN is a woman, the head of BBC News is a woman. There is a great change, but there is still a long way to go. It's very difficult for women who are so often freelance now to balance how they're going to have a career and have a family. It's a very unfamily friendly sort of area to work in, television. Having said that, I'm now the president of Murray Edwards College at Cambridge, and lots of the students here say they want to enter television and radio. And look at you, Mariella, you've had a great career, and I don't think 40 years ago you would have been able to do even something like present a program like this. It wouldn't have happened.
Well, I did do a panorama and about 25, 30 years ago, and it was loudly decried as the end of Panorama as an institution, to have me defacing it as a woman of shallowness and superficiality.
But I remember that. It was absolutely appalling. When you think of some of the dreadful old bores that have presented Panorama, and they criticised you. Anyway, you've seen them off, haven't you?
Well, we've seen some of them off. There's some of them still lurking, but it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And this series of 3 documentaries about Ghislaine Maxwell are absolutely extraordinary and incredibly gripping. And well done for making them. Thank you so much. That was Dorothy Byrne, the former head of news and current affairs at Channel 4 and producer of a new 3-part documentary series, Ghislaine Maxwell, Making of a Monster. This is Mariella Frostrup on Times Radio.